The antiseptic smell hit me first, followed by the sound of shuffling slippers on linoleum. Room 247 at Sunset Manor Care Facility had beige walls, a narrow bed with metal railings, and a view of the parking lot where seagulls picked through scattered French fries. This was my reward for building a maritime empire from nothing, a shared bathroom and mandatory bingo on Thursdays. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Harrison, though most folks called me Dot. At 70 years old, I should have been celebrating my birthday surrounded by family in the waterfront home I'd designed myself, watching the Oregon coast through floor-to-ceiling windows while sipping champagne. Instead, I was counting ceiling tiles in a nursing home while my son-in-law Richard Patterson threw a party in my house, toasting his cleverness with my own bourbon. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd negotiated million-dollar marina deals across 3 states, who'd survived the male-dominated shipping industry for 4 decades, who'd built Harrison Marine Supply from a single dock space into the Pacific Northwest's premier boat supply company, was now being told when to eat, when to sleep, and when to take her medications by staff young enough to be her grandchildren. The journey to this sterile room began 18 months earlier, though the seeds were planted much longer ago. My husband Walter and I had spent 43 years building our life together on the rugged Oregon coast. While other couples vacationed in Hawaii or Europe, we found our paradise in the salty air of Riverside's Marina District, where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean in a dance of currents and commerce. Walter Harrison was the kind of man who could fix any engine, navigate any storm, and charm any customer. But he was also the dreamer while I was the strategist. When we started Harrison Marine Supply in 1981 with a $5,000 loan and more ambition than sense, Walter focused on the boats and the customers while I handled everything else. Purchasing, inventory, finances, expansion plans, regulatory compliance. If it required paperwork or negotiation, it fell to me. Those early years tested every fiber of our partnership. We worked 16-hour days, lived on coffee and determination, and reinvested every penny back into the business. I learned to read maritime insurance policies like novels, memorized Coast Guard regulations, and developed relationships with suppliers from Seattle to San Diego. Walter would joke that I could negotiate the paint off a barnacle, but the truth was simpler. I understood that in business, preparation and persistence trumped charm every time. By 1995, we owned 3 locations along the coast. By 2005, we'd expanded into commercial fishing equipment and boat repair services. When Walter suffered his first heart attack in 2010, Harrison Marine was generating over $2 million in annual revenue, employed 37 people, and had a reputation for reliability that stretched from Alaska to California. Our daughter Linda was our pride and joy, though perhaps we sheltered her too much from the business side of our success. She grew up assuming that boats and prosperity were simply part of life, that college tuition and family vacations materialized, without sacrifice or struggle. When she met Richard Patterson during her senior year at Portland State, I should have paid closer attention to the warning signs. Richard was handsome in that artificial way that comes from expensive grooming and calculated charm. His family claimed old Portland money, though I later discovered their wealth was more legend than ledger. He spoke fluently about investment strategies and market opportunities, but his knowledge felt rehearsed, like lines memorized for an audition. Most troubling was how he looked at our marina properties during family visits, assessing and calculating, rather than appreciating. Walter, ever the optimist, dismissed my concerns. Linda was happy, Richard seemed ambitious, and his business degree from Oregon State suggested he could bring modern management techniques to Harrison Marine. When they married in 2015, Richard immediately began offering suggestions for streamlining operations and maximizing asset utilization. I bit my tongue, focusing on Walter's declining health rather than engaging in business debates with my new son-in-law. Walter's second heart attack came without warning on a foggy March morning in 2018. I found him collapsed in our kitchen, still wearing the Harrison Marine polo shirt he'd donned every morning for 37 years. The paramedics worked for 40 minutes, but the massive coronary had already claimed the only man I'd ever loved. At his funeral, the marina flew flags at half-mast, and fishing captains from 3 states came to pay their respects to the man, who'd kept their boats running and their crews safe. Grief has a way of blunting your instincts, making you vulnerable to manipulation disguised as concern. In the months following Walter's death, I struggled to maintain the energy and focus that had driven Harrison Marine's success. The morning alarm felt heavier, business decisions required more effort, and the waterfront office that had once energized me began feeling like an obligation rather than an opportunity. Richard noticed my struggles before I fully acknowledged them myself. He began stopping by the office more frequently, offering to handle correspondence or review supplier contracts. His attention felt supportive, even flattering. Here was my daughter's husband, successful in his own right, willing to help shoulder the burden of running the family business during my time of mourning. The first small compromise seemed reasonable. Richard suggested we consolidate our banking relationships, moving all Harrison Marine accounts to the investment firm where he worked as a financial advisor. Better coordination, he explained, and I can monitor the accounts personally to ensure optimal performance. I agreed, appreciating the reduced paperwork and Richard's apparent dedication to our family's financial well-being. The second compromise involved our insurance policies. Richard recommended switching to a company that offered better rates and more comprehensive coverage. The savings were legitimate, and the new agent, a colleague of Richard's, seemed knowledgeable about maritime businesses. I signed the papers without my usual exhaustive review, trusting Richard's expertise and grateful for his assistance. By Christmas 2019, Richard had become increasingly involved in Harrison Marine's daily operations. He installed new accounting software, renegotiated several supplier contracts, and began attending industry conferences on the company's behalf. Linda beamed with pride at family gatherings, praising her husband's business acumen and his dedication to preserving her father's legacy. I should have been suspicious when Richard suggested I consider retirement. "Dorothy, you've earned the right to relax," he said during a family dinner at our waterfront home. "Let me handle the day-to-day operations while you enjoy your golden years. Think of all the travel you and Walter planned but never had time for." The idea held appeal. I was 68, tired from 4 decades of maritime commerce, and still grieving Walter's absence from every decision and celebration. Richard's vision of gradual transition seemed thoughtful. He would assume increasing responsibility while I maintained oversight and final authority. Linda supported the plan enthusiastically, excited about her husband's expanding role in the family business. The transition began smoothly. Richard handled routine matters while consulting me on major decisions. He updated our computer systems, streamlined inventory management, and negotiated what appeared to be favorable contracts with new suppliers. Our employees seemed to respect his leadership, and our customers continued receiving the reliable service that had defined Harrison Marine for 4 decades. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic shifted. Richard began making decisions without consulting me, citing time pressures or the need for quick responses to market opportunities. When I questioned these changes, he responded with detailed explanations that made me feel outdated and obstructive. "Dorothy, the maritime industry has evolved," he would say patiently. "These new approaches are standard practice among successful companies." The isolation began subtly. Richard scheduled important meetings during times when I was unavailable, then briefed me afterward with summaries that felt incomplete. Key suppliers started calling Richard directly rather than going through me, explaining that he'd requested the change to streamline communications. Longtime business relationships that I'd cultivated over decades began shifting toward Richard, who presented himself as Harrison Marine's primary contact. My concerns deepened when I reviewed quarterly reports that seemed inconsistent with my understanding of our operations. Revenue figures looked strong, but cash flow appeared tighter than expected. When I asked Richard about these discrepancies, he produced detailed spreadsheets showing increased expenses for equipment upgrades and facility improvements that he claimed were necessary for remaining competitive. The most disturbing change was Linda's attitude toward me. My daughter, who had always sought my advice on everything from career decisions to decorating choices, began deferring to Richard's opinions even in matters unrelated to business. When I mentioned my concerns about the company's financial reports, Linda responded with gentle but firm suggestions that I was having difficulty adjusting to retirement and should consider reducing my involvement in business matters. The confrontation that changed everything occurred on a rainy Thursday in October 2020. I arrived at the marina office unexpectedly to find Richard meeting with two men I didn't recognize, reviewing documents spread across the conference table. When they saw me enter, the conversation stopped abruptly, and Richard quickly gathered the papers while introducing his companions as potential investors exploring expansion opportunities. Something about the scene felt wrong. The men's clothes were expensive but flashy, their handshakes too firm, their smiles too practiced. Most troubling was Richard's obvious discomfort at my unexpected arrival. After they left, I asked to review the documents they'd been discussing, but Richard claimed they were preliminary proposals that weren't ready for review. That evening, I made a decision that Walter would have supported. I drove to our old friend, Frank Morrison's house, and asked for his help. Frank had been Walter's contemporary in the maritime industry, building his own successful tugboat operation before selling to a larger company in 2015. More importantly, he was one of the few people who understood both the technical and financial aspects of marine businesses well enough to spot irregularities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frank's investigation revealed problems that went far beyond mismanagement. The accounting software Richard had installed was generating two sets of books, one showing healthy profits for my review, another revealing significant losses and suspicious transactions. The insurance policies Richard had negotiated were actually increasing our costs while reducing coverage, but the differences were buried in complex rider provisions that required expert analysis to understand. Most alarming was Frank's discovery of several large equipment purchases that had never arrived at our facilities. According to the invoices, Harrison Marine had bought hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of marine engines, navigation equipment, and safety gear that didn't exist in our inventory. When Frank traced the serial numbers, he found that some of the equipment had been resold through intermediary companies connected to Richard's investment firm. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Over 18 months, Richard had systematically looted Harrison Marine while maintaining the appearance of successful operations. He'd used fake invoices to justify cash withdrawals, inflated supplier costs to skim profits, and established shell companies to facilitate the theft. The business Walter and I had spent 4 decades building was essentially broke, kept afloat only by credit lines that Richard had secretly established using company assets as collateral. Frank's most disturbing discovery involved the potential investors I'd interrupted during their meeting. These weren't legitimate businessmen exploring expansion opportunities. They were Richard's associates in a money laundering operation that used Harrison Marine as a front for cleaning cash from illegal activities. The marina's legitimate transactions provided perfect cover for moving dirty money through boat purchases, equipment sales, and facility rentals that existed only on paper. When I confronted Richard with Frank's findings, his response revealed the calculated nature of his deception. Rather than denying the evidence or expressing remorse, he calmly explained that he'd been planning to tell me about the temporary cash flow challenges but hadn't wanted to worry me during my adjustment to retirement. The missing equipment, he claimed, was being held at a secure warehouse pending delivery to customers who were experiencing their own delays. His explanation was smooth, practiced, and utterly false. But more chilling was his subtle threat about the consequences of overreacting to what he characterized as normal business complications. "Dorothy, you're 70 years old and haven't been actively managing the company for months," he said with patronizing concern. "These financial matters are complex, and mistakes in handling them could have serious implications for Linda's future security." The message was clear. If I pursued the matter further, Linda would suffer the consequences. Richard had positioned himself as both the problem and the solution, the cause of Harrison Marine's troubles and the only person capable of resolving them. By threatening Linda's financial well-being, he was leveraging my maternal instincts against my business judgment. But Richard had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed that grief and age had dulled my strategic thinking, that the woman who'd built a maritime empire was now too fragile to fight back. He didn't know about the contingency plans Walter and I had established during our early struggling years, the hidden assets we'd accumulated as insurance against disaster, or the network of contacts I'd cultivated across 4 decades in the maritime industry. Most importantly, he didn't know that Frank Morrison wasn't just investigating Richard's activities. He was documenting them with the thoroughness that comes from 40 years in an industry where attention to detail can mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy, between reputation and ruin. Every fake invoice, every suspicious transaction, every shell company connection was being carefully cataloged and verified. As I sat in that nursing home room 18 months later, staring at the ceiling tiles while seagulls cawed outside, my window I reflected on how Richard's final gambit had been the most audacious of all. Unable to complete his theft of Harrison Marine while I remained involved, he'd convinced Linda that my increasing confusion and paranoia about business matters indicated early-stage dementia that required professional intervention. The nursing home placement wasn't presented as punishment, but as loving concern for my safety and well-being. Linda tearfully explained that I'd been making irrational accusations against Richard, forgetting important appointments, and showing signs of the cognitive decline that had claimed her grandfather in his final years. Sunset Manor, she assured me, provided excellent care for residents experiencing memory issues, and the decision was temporary pending evaluation by specialists. Richard's manipulation of the situation was masterful. By having me declared incompetent to manage my affairs, he gained legal authority over Harrison Marine and my personal assets. The nursing home placement isolated me from business contacts and family friends who might question the arrangement. Most effectively, it positioned any protests I made as symptoms of mental deterioration rather than legitimate concerns about criminal activity. But as I lay in that narrow bed on my 70th birthday, listening to my roommate's television playing game shows at excessive volume, I wasn't feeling defeated or helpless. Instead, I was experiencing something I hadn't felt since Walter's death, the electric anticipation that comes with planning a strategic counterstrike. Richard Patterson had spent 2 years systematically stealing from Harrison Marine, manipulating my daughter, and positioning himself as the family's financial savior. He'd used my grief against me, my love for Linda as leverage, and my age as a weapon to discredit my concerns. He'd isolated me from my business, my home, and my independence, confident that a 70-year-old widow could be easily controlled and ultimately discarded. What he didn't know was that Dorothy Harrison wasn't finished fighting. The woman who'd survived 4 decades in the maritime industry, who'd built a multi-million-dollar business from a single dock space, who'd navigated economic recessions and industry consolidations, had one final move planned. And tomorrow, Richard Patterson was going to discover that underestimating a Harrison woman was the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. The wake-up call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 17 days after my involuntary admission to Sunset Manor. My roommate Gladys had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the institutional silence that fills care facilities during the small hours. I'd been lying awake anyway, my mind churning through the events that had brought me to this beige-walled purgatory. The previous afternoon had delivered the final blow to any illusions I'd maintained about Linda's loyalty. She'd visited during the scheduled family hour, bringing flowers and platitudes about my adjustment period, and how the staff reported I was settling in nicely. When I'd tried once again to explain about Richard's theft from Harrison Marine, about the fake invoices, and missing equipment, she'd responded with the practiced patience reserved for confused elderly relatives. "Mom, we've been over this," Linda had said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used when explaining to her childhood friends that Grandpa sometimes forgot things. "Richard showed me all the financial reports. The business is doing well. You're just having trouble letting go of control, which is completely understandable." The dismissal stung worse than any physical blow. This was my daughter, the child I'd taught to tie her shoes and balance a checkbook, who had spent countless afternoons at the marina learning to distinguish between different types of marine hardware. Yet she was choosing to believe her husband's fabricated reports over her mother's first-hand knowledge of irregularities that any competent business person could spot. But what truly shattered my remaining faith in Linda's judgment was her casual mention of the exciting developments Richard was planning for Harrison Marine. According to her, he was negotiating a partnership with a major West Coast shipping company that would triple our revenue within 2 years. The deal required significant upfront investment in new equipment and facility upgrades, but Richard had assured her the returns would be extraordinary. I'd listened to this fantasy with growing horror, recognizing the classic pattern of a Ponzi scheme expanding to cover earlier thefts. Richard was using the promise of future profits to justify current expenditures that would never generate returns because the money was being stolen rather than invested. The shipping partnership was undoubtedly as fictional as the equipment, purchases that had already drained hundreds of thousands from company accounts. "Linda," I'd said, gripping her hand with desperate urgency, "ask him to show you the actual partnership agreement. Not a summary or a proposal, but the signed contract with the shipping company. Ask to see their financial statements, their licensing documentation, their insurance certificates. If this deal is legitimate, those documents will exist." My daughter had pulled her hand away with obvious discomfort. "Mom, you're doing it again. This obsession with paperwork and documentation isn't healthy. Richard handles all that business stuff now. You need to focus on your recovery and let go of these worries." Recovery from what? I'd wanted to scream. I wasn't sick, confused, or mentally impaired. I was a businesswoman who'd identified systematic fraud and was being silenced by family members who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But arguing further would only reinforce Linda's belief that I was experiencing cognitive decline, so I'd nodded and changed the subject to safer topics like the facility's recreational activities and meal schedules. After Linda left, I'd sat in the community room staring at the muted television while other residents dozed in their recliners or worked on jigsaw puzzles depicting pastoral scenes that bore no resemblance to their current reality. The despair that settled over me wasn't just personal. It was the profound sadness that comes from watching someone you love make choices that will ultimately destroy them. Because that's what Richard was doing to Linda, though she couldn't see it yet. When Harrison Marine finally collapsed under the weight of his theft and fraudulent schemes, Linda would bear the consequences as the owner's daughter and the thief's wife. Her name was on several company documents. Her signature appeared on bank forms that Richard had requested she sign for administrative purposes, and her inheritance was being systematically stolen by the man she trusted most. The 3 a.m. moment of clarity came as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the mechanical hum of medical equipment in distant rooms. I'd been approaching this situation all wrong, treating it as a family problem that could be resolved through communication and evidence. But Richard wasn't a misguided family member making poor business decisions. He was a criminal who had identified Harrison Marine as a target and me as an obstacle to be removed. The nursing home placement wasn't about my mental health or safety. It was the final step in Richard's plan to gain complete control over the company assets, while eliminating any witnesses to his theft. By having me declared incompetent, he'd achieved legal authority over my affairs while positioning himself as Linda's protector against my paranoid accusations. But here's what Richard didn't understand about the maritime industry, about the relationships forged over decades of shared challenges and mutual respect. When you've spent 40 years negotiating with suppliers, customers, and competitors who judge you solely on your reliability and competence, you develop a network of contacts who know your true character. These weren't casual acquaintances who could be easily convinced of your mental decline. They were business partners who had trusted you with million-dollar transactions and never been disappointed. Frank Morrison wasn't the only ally I could count on. There was Captain Sarah Chen, who'd been buying marine supplies from Harrison Marine for 15 years and had never received anything but straight dealing and fair prices. There was Miguel Rodriguez, whose family trucking company had been transporting our equipment for 2 decades and knew the difference between legitimate business operations and suspicious activities. There was Janet Williams, the harbor master who'd worked with me on countless regulatory issues and understood both the legal and practical aspects of maritime commerce. These people knew Dorothy Harrison as a sharp businesswoman who didn't make baseless accusations or imagine financial irregularities that didn't exist. If I could reach them, if I could share Frank's documentation of Richard's theft, they would believe the evidence over the convenient fiction that grief and age had clouded my judgment. The challenge was communication. Sunset Manor monitored phone calls to ensure residents weren't being exploited by scammers or making inappropriate contact with people outside the facility. My mail was screened for security purposes, and my computer access was limited to supervised sessions in the community room where privacy was impossible. Richard had effectively cut me off from the outside world while maintaining the appearance of protecting my welfare. But institutional restrictions designed to protect vulnerable residents weren't prepared for someone like me, a woman who'd spent decades finding creative solutions to regulatory obstacles and logistical challenges. The same strategic thinking that had built Harrison Marine from a single dock space into a regional power could be applied to escaping the comfortable prison Richard had constructed around me. The first step was establishing covert communication with Frank Morrison. During my supervised computer time, I created an email account using a variation of my maiden name that wouldn't immediately connect to Dorothy Harrison. Instead of sending direct messages about Richard's crimes, I began posting comments on maritime industry blogs and forums where I knew Frank was active, using coded language that would be meaningless to casual observers but clear to someone who knew me well. When I posted about equipment suppliers who promised delivery but never follow through, Frank would understand I was referring to Richard's fake invoices. When I mentioned new management techniques that prioritize style over substance, he'd recognize my concerns about Richard's flashy but ineffective business practices. Most importantly, when I wrote about old-fashioned business people who believe in face-to-face meetings to resolve complex problems, Frank would know I was asking him to visit me at Sunset Manor. The second step was building credibility with the nursing home staff. Rather than ranting about Richard's crimes or demanding immediate release, I focused on demonstrating cognitive clarity and emotional stability. I participated in facility activities, helped other residents with problems they couldn't solve alone, and engaged staff members in conversations that showcased my knowledge and experience. When Nurse Patricia mentioned her son's struggles with his small boat repair business, I provided detailed advice about supplier relationships and customer service that helped him increase his revenue by 30%. When Activities Director Mark needed help organizing a fundraiser for facility improvements, I drew on decades of event planning experience to create a successful auction that raised $12,000. When social worker Lisa was dealing with a resident whose family was arguing about financial arrangements, I shared insights about family dynamics and communication strategies that helped resolve the conflict. These interactions served a dual purpose. They established my reputation as someone whose advice was valuable and whose judgment was sound, creating a foundation of credibility for when I eventually needed staff support. They also provided opportunities to gather information about facility policies, staff schedules, and security procedures that might prove useful for future planning. The third step was the most delicate: rebuilding trust with Linda without triggering her defensive reactions. Instead of confronting her about Richard's deception, I began asking gentle questions about her own observations and concerns. Did she notice anything unusual about the company's financial reports? Had Richard explained why certain longtime suppliers were no longer being used? Was she comfortable with the level of debt the business was carrying for the equipment upgrades? Initially, Linda deflected these questions with the same rehearsed responses about Richard's expertise and my need to trust his judgment. But gradually, I detected subtle signs of uncertainty. She mentioned that Richard had been working unusually long hours and seemed stressed about business matters he wouldn't discuss with her. She'd noticed that some of Harrison Marine's longtime employees had left recently, though Richard had explained their departures as voluntary career changes. Most telling was Linda's casual comment about their personal finances. Despite Richard's claims about Harrison Marine's growing profitability, their household budget had actually tightened over the past year. Richard had explained this as temporary cash flow management, but Linda was beginning to wonder why a supposedly successful business couldn't support their previous lifestyle. These small admissions gave me hope that Linda's faith in Richard wasn't as absolute as she pretended. The cognitive dissonance between his promises and their actual circumstances was creating doubt, even if she wasn't yet ready to acknowledge it openly. My role was to nurture that doubt without pushing so hard that she retreated into denial. The breakthrough came during Frank Morrison's visit, which he arranged by presenting himself as a concerned family friend checking on my welfare. The nursing home staff, impressed by my helpful contributions to facility life, allowed the meeting in a private consultation room typically reserved for family conferences. Frank looked older than when I'd last seen him, his weathered face showing the strain of investigating Richard's crimes while maintaining the pretense of casual concern. But his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had built his tugboat empire, and his handshake conveyed the strength of someone who'd spent decades handling heavy maritime equipment. "Dorothy," he said quietly, ensuring we couldn't be overheard. "I've got everything we discussed. The documentation is solid, but the situation is worse than we thought." He handed me a manila folder disguised as get-well cards and personal letters. Inside were photocopies of bank records, supplier invoices, and financial statements that painted a devastating picture of Richard's systematic theft. The missing equipment purchases totaled over $400,000, but that was only the beginning. Richard had also been skimming from customer payments, inflating operating expenses, and borrowing against company assets to fund personal expenditures that ranged from luxury travel to high-end electronics. "The money laundering operation is the real problem," Frank continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those associates of his aren't just stealing from Harrison Marine. They're using the business to clean cash from drug trafficking and illegal gambling operations. The Coast Guard and FBI have been watching some of these transactions for months." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore. It was organized crime activity that could result in federal charges for anyone connected to the Pi business. Linda's signature on company documents that Richard had requested for administrative purposes could potentially implicate her as an accessory to money laundering, even if she was completely unaware of the illegal activities. Frank's investigation had also revealed the true purpose of Richard's recent business trips to California and Washington. He hadn't been meeting with legitimate customers or suppliers. He'd been coordinating with criminal associates who were using Harrison Marine's shipping connections to move contraband along the West Coast. The marina facilities that Walter and I had built to serve honest fishermen and recreational boaters were being used as staging areas for illegal operations. "We need to act fast," Frank said urgently. "My contacts at the Coast Guard say they're planning to move against this operation within the next few weeks. If Linda is still connected to the business when that happens, she could face federal charges regardless of her actual knowledge or involvement. The weight of the situation settled over me like a cold fog rolling in from the Pacific. My daughter wasn't just being financially exploited by her husband, she was being set up as a potential fall guy for his criminal enterprise. When the federal agents moved against Richard's operation, they would arrest everyone connected to Harrison Marine, and Linda's name appeared on enough company documents to make her look like a co-conspirator rather than a victim. Frank had anticipated my concerns about Linda's safety. "I've been in contact with a federal prosecutor who specializes in maritime crimes," he explained. "If we can get Linda to cooperate with their investigation, to provide information about Richard's activities and testify about what she's observed, they'll offer her immunity in exchange for her cooperation. But convincing Linda to turn against her husband would require more than evidence of his crimes. It would require breaking through the psychological manipulation that had convinced her to trust Richard's explanations over her own observations, to dismiss her mother's concerns as symptoms of mental decline rather than legitimate warnings about criminal activity." "There's something else," Frank said, his expression growing even more serious. "Richard has been asking questions about you, specifically about when you might be declared permanently incompetent and what would happen to your personal assets if you died while in care. My source at the nursing home says he's been researching the facility's policies about end-of-life decisions and medical power of attorney." The implication was chilling. Richard hadn't just orchestrated my nursing home placement to silence my objections to his theft. He was potentially planning to make that silence permanent. If I died while under his legal guardianship, he would inherit control of my remaining assets and eliminate the only witness who could connect him to the systematic looting of Harrison Marine. But Frank's warning also crystallized my resolve. I'd spent too many years building something meaningful to let a criminal like Richard destroy it without a fight. The business that Walter and I had created, the employees who depended on Harrison Marine for their livelihoods, the customers who trusted us with their maritime needs, they all deserved better than being sacrificed to one man's greed and ambition. "What do you need from me?" I asked Frank, knowing that whatever plan we developed would require careful coordination to protect Linda while exposing Richard's crimes. Frank smiled for the first time since entering the consultation room. "I need you to be Dorothy Harrison again, the woman who built a maritime empire, who could negotiate with the toughest suppliers and handle the most difficult customers. Because we're about to take on the biggest challenge of your career." As he outlined the plan we would execute over the coming weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Walter's death. The electric thrill of strategic planning combined with absolute determination to succeed. Richard Patterson had made the fatal mistake of underestimating a Harrison woman, and he was about to learn that some battles are won not through force or deception, but through superior preparation and unshakable resolve. The game was about to change, and this time, I would be the one making the rules. The transformation began with something as simple as a haircut. I'd been letting my silver hair grow unkempt during my first month at Sunset Manor, partly from depression and partly because maintaining appearances seemed pointless when confined to an institutional setting. But strategy requires psychology, and psychology begins with confidence. If I was going to convince federal prosecutors, Coast Guard investigators, and my own daughter that Dorothy Harrison was still a force to be reckoned with, I needed to look and act the part. Janet Phillips, the facility's beautician, worked miracles with scissors and styling gel. My hair emerged shorter, sleeker, and unmistakably professional. When I requested makeup consultation, she taught me techniques that emphasized my eyes and cheekbones while minimizing the stress lines that months of worry had etched around my mouth. The woman who stared back from the salon mirror looked like someone who belonged in a boardroom, not a nursing home. The wardrobe came next. I'd been wearing the comfortable but shapeless clothes that Linda had packed for my stay. Elastic waistbands, cardigan sweaters and soft shoes suitable for shuffling around linoleum hallways. But Frank Morrison had quietly arranged for deliveries of business attire through his wife, Margaret, who shared my size and understood the importance of projecting authority through appearance. Within a week, my closet contained tailored blazers, pressed slacks, and leather shoes that clicked with purposeful authority on the facility's floors. The transformation wasn't lost on staff members, who began treating me less like a confused resident and more like the accomplished businesswoman I'd always been. Respect breeds respect, and the first step toward regaining control of my situation was commanding the respect of those around me. The second phase involved expanding my network of allies beyond Frank Morrison. The maritime industry operates on relationships built over decades of mutual trust and successful transactions. Even confined to Sunset Manor, I could leverage those relationships through careful communication and strategic positioning. My first recruit was Captain Sarah Chen, whose fishing operation depended on reliable equipment and honest suppliers. Sarah had been buying marine supplies from Harrison Marine for 15 years, and her business success was partly due to the quality gear and fair pricing we'd always provided. When I managed to reach her through the coded messages on maritime forums, her response was immediate and concerned. Sarah's visit to Sunset Manor was arranged as a routine social call from a longtime family friend. But once we were alone in the visitors' lounge, she listened with growing anger as I explained Richard's systematic theft and money laundering operation. As someone who understood both the financial and practical aspects of maritime business, she immediately grasped the significance of the fake invoices and missing equipment. "Dorothy, this is criminal activity on a massive scale," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Richard isn't just stealing from your company, he's using your reputation and customer relationships to defraud the entire industry. Some of that equipment he claimed to purchase was supposed to be safety gear for fishing boats. When captains don't get the equipment they paid for, people die." Sarah's perspective added a dimension to Richard's crimes that I hadn't fully considered. The fake safety equipment purchases weren't just financial fraud. They were potentially putting lives at risk. Fishing captains who thought they'd purchased emergency beacons, life rafts, and communication equipment through Harrison Marine were operating with a false sense of security that could prove fatal during Pacific storms. But Sarah brought more than moral outrage to our alliance. Her fishing operation employed 12 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue, making her a respected voice in Oregon's maritime community. When she began quietly contacting other captains and boat operators about suspicious transactions involving Harrison Marine, her inquiries carried weight that couldn't be dismissed as the complaints of a confused elderly woman. The network expanded systematically. Miguel Rodriguez, whose trucking company had transported Harrison Marine equipment for 2 decades, confirmed that several recent deliveries had never actually occurred. The invoices showed expensive equipment being shipped to legitimate customers, but Miguel's drivers had no record of picking up or delivering these items. The trucks had been paid for transportation services they'd never provided, making Miguel's company unwitting participants in Richard's fraud. Harbor Master Janet Williams provided perhaps the most crucial intelligence. Her position gave her oversight of all commercial maritime activities in Riverside's Port District, including the permits and inspections required for legitimate business operations. When I asked her to review recent permit applications and facility inspections involving Harrison Marine, she discovered a pattern of irregularities that painted a disturbing picture. Richard had been applying for permits to expand Harrison Marine's storage facilities and dock space, claiming the growth was necessary to accommodate increasing inventory and customer demand. But the permits requested far exceeded what our actual business volume would require. More troubling, some of the permitted facilities were being used for activities that didn't match the approved purposes. "Dorothy, there are warehouses being rented under Harrison Marine's name that are supposed to be storing marine equipment," Janet explained during her carefully arranged visit. "But my inspection reports show they're mostly empty, or they contain items that don't match the inventory lists your company provided. It looks like someone is using your business licenses and permits to legitimize operations that have nothing to do with marine supplies. The implications were staggering. Richard wasn't just using Harrison Marine to steal money. He was using our business permits and licenses to provide legal cover for criminal operations. The empty warehouses could be used for storing contraband between shipments. The excess dock space could accommodate boats involved in smuggling operations. The legitimate maritime business that Walter and I had built was being transformed into a front for organized crime. But Janet's investigation revealed an even more immediate threat. Richard had recently applied for permits to expand Harrison Marine's fuel storage capacity, claiming the need to provide diesel and gasoline services to commercial fishing vessels. The permit application requested authorization to store thousands of gallons of fuel in underground tanks that would be installed near the main marina facilities. "The problem is location," Janet said, showing me detailed marina maps. "The proposed fuel storage site is directly adjacent to the Coast Guard inspection station. If someone wanted to move contraband through the marina without Coast Guard interference, having a legitimate reason to position boats near the inspection area would be invaluable. They could coordinate timing, observe patrol schedules, even create diversions using fuel delivery operations." The pattern was becoming clear. Richard's expansion plans weren't designed to grow Harrison Marine's legitimate business. They were creating infrastructure to support large-scale smuggling operations. The fuel storage permits would provide cover for suspicious boat traffic. The warehouse leases would provide secure storage for contraband. The dock space expansions would accommodate vessels that weren't actually delivering marine equipment. My growing alliance needed coordination and strategic planning. Frank Morrison's house became our unofficial headquarters, where we met weekly to share intelligence and plan our next moves. The group now included Frank, Sarah Chen, Miguel Rodriguez, Harbor Master Janet Williams, and Dr. Patricia Sullivan, a maritime attorney who'd handled regulatory issues for Harrison Marine over the years. Dr. Sullivan's legal expertise proved invaluable for understanding the federal implications of Richard's activities. As she reviewed the evidence we'd assembled, her expression grew increasingly grave. The money laundering charges alone could result in decades in federal prison, but the use of maritime facilities for smuggling operations triggered additional penalties under federal maritime law. "This isn't just financial fraud," Dr. Sullivan explained during one of our clandestine meetings. "Using licensed maritime facilities to support criminal operations is considered a threat to national security. The Coast Guard and FBI don't just prosecute these cases, they treat them as potential terrorism investigations because of the implications for port security." The federal attention explained why Richard's criminal associates were so concerned about maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. They weren't just avoiding local law enforcement. They were trying to stay below the radar of federal agencies that had vast resources for investigating maritime crimes. But Dr. Sullivan's most important contribution was strategic advice about timing and coordination. Federal investigations of maritime crimes typically involve multiple agencies and require months of surveillance and evidence gathering before arrests are made. If we moved too quickly or too obviously, we could alert Richard's associates and trigger a shutdown of their operations before law enforcement was ready to act. The key is providing federal investigators with enough evidence to justify immediate action while protecting Linda from criminal liability, Dr. Sullivan advised. "We need to document Richard's crimes thoroughly but quietly, then coordinate with federal prosecutors to ensure Linda receives immunity in exchange for her cooperation." The evidence-gathering phase required careful coordination to avoid detection. Each member of our alliance had specific responsibilities based on their access to different types of information. Sarah Chen monitored suspicious boat traffic and equipment transactions. Miguel Rodriguez tracked fake shipping activities and documented phantom deliveries. Janet Williams reviewed permit applications and facility inspections for irregularities. Frank Morrison coordinated our activities while maintaining his cover as a concerned family friend. His weekly visits to Sunset Manor provided opportunities for me to review evidence and provide strategic guidance based on my intimate knowledge of Harrison Marine's operations and customer relationships. My role from within the nursing home was perhaps the most challenging. I needed to maintain the appearance of cognitive decline and institutional dependency while actually serving as the strategic coordinator for a complex investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard had placed me in an environment where I was underestimated and dismissed, but that same environment provided perfect cover for activities he would never suspect. The breakthrough came when Miguel Rodriguez's drivers reported suspicious activity at one of the warehouses Richard had leased under Harrison Marine's name. Instead of marine equipment, the facility was being used to store unmarked crates that arrived by truck at irregular hours and were picked up by boats that didn't appear on any marina schedules. Miguel's investigation revealed that the crates contained high-end electronics, luxury goods, and other items that suggested organized theft rings rather than legitimate marine commerce. The warehouse wasn't just storage for contraband, it was a distribution center for stolen merchandise being moved through maritime shipping channels to avoid law enforcement detection. This discovery provided the missing piece of Richard's criminal operation. He wasn't just stealing money from Harrison Marine and laundering cash for criminal associates. He was also using our business facilities and permits to support theft rings that operated across multiple states. The legitimate maritime business was providing perfect cover for receiving, storing, and shipping stolen goods throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Sullivan's contacts in federal law enforcement confirmed that Richard's operation was part of a larger investigation involving organized crime families with connections from California to Alaska. The theft rings, money laundering operations, and smuggling activities were all connected through a network of legitimate businesses that provided cover for criminal enterprises. The federal prosecutors are very interested in your evidence, Dr. Sullivan reported after her meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chang. They've been building cases against several members of this criminal network, but they need insider information to connect all the pieces. Dorothy's knowledge of Harrison Marine's legitimate operations could be crucial for distinguishing between legal and illegal activities. But the federal interest also created urgency. Once law enforcement began moving against Richard's criminal associates, the entire network would shut down quickly to avoid prosecution. If Linda was still legally connected to Harrison Marine when that happened, she could face federal charges as an accessory to the criminal enterprise, regardless of her actual knowledge or involvement. The plan that emerged from our strategy sessions was complex but necessary. We needed to extract Linda from her legal connections to Harrison Marine while simultaneously providing federal prosecutors with evidence to prosecute Richard and his associates. The timing had to be precise, too early, and Richard would become suspicious and potentially dangerous. Too late, and Linda could be caught in the federal dragnet. Phase 1 involved gradually awakening Linda's suspicions about Richard's activities, without directly confronting her about his crimes. Sarah Chen and other Harrison Marine customers would begin asking Linda innocent questions about equipment deliveries and service issues that would highlight discrepancies between Richard's claims and actual business operations. Phase 2 would involve Dr. Sullivan approaching Linda with concerns about potential legal liability from questionable business practices. As Harrison Marine's former attorney, Dr. Sullivan had standing to raise concerns about regulatory compliance and fiduciary responsibility that Linda couldn't easily dismiss. Phase 3 was the most delicate, convincing Linda to cooperate with federal investigators while protecting her from Richard's potential retaliation. The criminal associates he worked with weren't known for tolerating witnesses or cooperators, and Linda's safety would depend on careful coordination with law enforcement protection services. But first, we needed to address the immediate threat to my own safety. Frank's sources had confirmed that Richard was researching end-of-life procedures and inheritance laws with suspicious intensity. If he decided that permanently silencing me was preferable to risking exposure of his crimes, the nursing home setting provided numerous opportunities for accidental deaths that would raise no suspicion. The solution required leveraging my growing influence with Sunset Manor's staff. Over months of helpful contributions to facility operations and genuine concern for fellow residents, I'd built relationships with nurses, administrators, and support, staff who respected my judgment and appreciated my assistance. When I quietly shared concerns about Richard's behavior and intentions with key staff members, they listened with the attention they'd give to any credible threat assessment. The facility's security protocols were discreetly enhanced. My medical care was monitored more closely, and Richard's access to my personal information was restricted without creating obvious confrontation. But the most important element of our strategy was psychological. Richard's confidence in his plan depended on his belief that I was a helpless victim who posed no threat to his operations. As long as he thought I was a confused elderly woman, whose complaints could be dismissed as symptoms of mental decline, he would continue operating with the careless arrogance that made evidence gathering possible. The moment he realized that Dorothy Harrison was still a formidable adversary with powerful allies and damning evidence of his crimes, the game would change completely. Richard would shift from confident predator to desperate fugitive. And desperate, criminals make dangerous decisions that put everyone around them at risk. Our timeline was accelerating. Federal investigators were preparing to move against Richard's criminal network within weeks. Linda's legal vulnerability was increasing, as more evidence accumulated of Harrison Marine's involvement in criminal activities. My own safety depended on maintaining the fiction of helplessness while actually coordinating a complex operation to expose organized crime. The final phase was about to begin, and everything would depend on perfect timing, absolute coordination, and the kind of strategic thinking that had built Harrison Marine from a single dock space into a regional maritime power. Dorothy Harrison was ready to remind everyone why underestimating a maritime businesswoman was always a fatal mistake. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, jarring me from the light sleep that had become my norm since orchestrating the investigation into Richard's criminal empire. Nurse Patricia's voice carried an urgency that immediately sharpened my focus despite the early hour. "Mrs. Harrison, your daughter is here to see you. She seems quite upset and is asking to speak. Privately. I've arranged for you to use the family conference room." Linda stood by the window when I entered, her usually perfect appearance disheveled in a way that suggested she'd been awake most of the night. Her hands shook as she turned to face me, and her eyes held a combination of fear and dawning comprehension that I'd been dreading yet hoping for over the past several months. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Not what you think I want to hear, not what might protect my feelings, but the absolute truth." I settled into the chair across from her, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well through decades of difficult business negotiations. "Of course, sweetheart. What's troubling you?" Linda pulled out her phone and opened a series of text messages. Richard left his phone on the kitchen counter last night when he went to shower. It kept buzzing with messages, and I glanced at it thinking it might be an emergency. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the conversation. "Mom, there are messages here about moving merchandise, about payments that need to be cleaned, about keeping certain people quiet, and there's a message about you." She turned the phone toward me, and I read the message that had shattered her faith in the man she'd married. The text was from someone identified only as TC and read, "Old lady becoming problem, need permanent. Solution before feds move. Make it look natural." The blood in my veins turned to ice water, not from fear for my own safety, but from the realization that Linda had stumbled across evidence that put her in immediate danger. If Richard discovered that she'd seen these messages, her knowledge would make her a liability that his criminal associates wouldn't hesitate to eliminate. "Linda," I said carefully, "where is Richard now?" "He left early this morning, said he had meetings in Portland and wouldn't be back until tonight." She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Mom, I've been so stupid. All those times you tried to warn me, all those concerns you raised about the business irregularities, and I dismissed them as confusion or jealousy. But you were right, weren't you? Richard has been lying to me about everything. The moment I'd been preparing for had arrived, but not in the controlled circumstances I'd hoped for. Linda had discovered the truth through accident rather than the careful revelation we'd planned, and her emotional state made strategic thinking difficult, but her safety depended on immediate action and clear-headed decision-making. "Linda, I need you to listen very carefully," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Richard is involved in criminal activities that go far beyond stealing from Harrison Marine. The people he's working with are dangerous, and now that you've seen those messages, you're in danger too." I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "But I haven't been sitting here helplessly like Richard believes. I've been working with people who can protect you and bring him to justice. However, we need to act quickly and follow a very specific plan." Linda's eyes widened as I explained the network of allies we'd assembled and the evidence we'd gathered over the past months. The woman who'd dismissed her mother's concerns as symptoms of mental decline gradually understood that Dorothy Harrison had been conducting a sophisticated investigation while maintaining the appearance of institutional helplessness. "You've been coordinating all this from the nursing home?" Linda asked, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "How did you manage to investigate Richard's crimes while everyone thought you were confused and dependent?" "Because Richard made the same mistake that many people make about older women," I replied. "He assumed that age equals incompetence, that grief equals vulnerability, and that institutional confinement equals powerlessness. He saw what he wanted to see instead of recognizing what I actually am." But there was no time for extended explanations. Linda's discovery of the threatening messages had accelerated our timeline dramatically. If Richard suspected that she'd seen his communications, he might take drastic action to protect himself and his criminal associates. We needed to implement our protection plan immediately, while coordinating with federal investigators to ensure evidence was preserved. I used the nursing home's phone to call Frank Morrison, using our predetermined code phrase that would alert him to emergency circumstances. Within minutes, he was coordinating with Dr. Sullivan and the federal prosecutors to arrange immediate protection for Linda while preserving the integrity of their ongoing investigation. The next few hours unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Dr. Sullivan arrived at Sunset Manor with Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chang and 2 FBI agents who specialized in maritime crimes. Linda provided her statement about Richard's suspicious activities and turned over his phone, which contained months of incriminating communications with his criminal associates. Agent Martinez, who led the Maritime Crimes Unit, explained the scope of the federal investigation that had been building around Richard's operations. "Mrs. Patterson, your husband is part of a criminal network that spans from California to Alaska. They've been using legitimate maritime businesses to launder money, transport stolen goods, and coordinate smuggling operations. Your mother's evidence has been crucial in connecting activities at Harrison Marine to this larger criminal enterprise." Linda's face paled as she absorbed the full extent of Richard's deception. "How long has this been going on? How could I have lived with him for years without knowing he was a criminal?" Agent Chen, Martinez's partner, responded with the patience of someone who dealt with many victims of sophisticated criminal manipulation. "These operations depend on maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. Your husband needed you to believe in his success and trustworthiness because your faith in him provided credibility with customers, suppliers, and regulatory agencies. You weren't naive. You were being deliberately deceived by professionals. But the immediate priority was Linda's safety. The text messages on Richard's phone indicated that his criminal associates were planning to take permanent action against me before federal investigators could move against their network. If they suspected that Linda had discovered their communications, she would become an equally urgent target. The witness protection arrangements were implemented immediately. Linda would be relocated to a secure federal facility where she could provide detailed testimony about Richard's activities while remaining safe from retaliation. Her cooperation with the federal investigation would ensure immunity from prosecution, despite her technical legal connections to Harrison Marine's criminal activities. "What about Mom?" Linda asked as the federal agents explained the protection protocols. "If they're planning to hurt her, she needs protection too." Agent Martinez smiled grimly. "Your mother has been remarkably resourceful in protecting herself. The nursing home staff has been briefed about security concerns, and we have surveillance in place to monitor any attempts against her safety. But more importantly, we're moving against the entire criminal network tomorrow morning. By this time, next week, Richard and his associates will be in federal custody." The coordinated federal operation had been planned for months, but Linda's discovery of the threatening messages had provided the final evidence prosecutors needed to justify immediate arrests. Richard's communications about permanent solutions constituted conspiracy to commit murder, elevating the charges from financial crimes to violent felonies that carried life sentences. But first, we needed to ensure that Richard didn't suspect the investigation had been compromised. Linda would return home and maintain normal behavior until the federal agents were ready to move. Any deviation from routine might alert Richard or his associates that their communications had been discovered. The next 18 hours tested every strategic skill I'd developed over 4 decades in business. Linda had to interact normally with Richard while knowing he was planning my murder, and potentially hers as well. I had to maintain the appearance of institutional routine while coordinating final details with federal investigators. Our entire network of allies had to continue their normal activities while preparing for the culmination of months of careful investigation. Richard's behavior that evening, as reported by Linda through secure communications, revealed a man under increasing pressure from his criminal associates. He made several phone calls from his home office, speaking in the coded language that federal investigators had been monitoring for weeks. The stress of coordinating criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business success was clearly taking its toll. But Richard's greatest mistake was his continued underestimation of the women in his life. He assumed that Linda's years of trusting acceptance meant she would never question his explanations or investigate his activities. He believed that my months of apparent institutional helplessness had eliminated me as a threat to his operations. His arrogance blinded him to the possibility that Dorothy Harrison was still capable of strategic thinking and coordinated action. The federal operation began at dawn on Friday morning with simultaneous raids across 3 states. Richard was arrested at Harrison Marine's main office, where he'd arrived early to destroy additional evidence before a scheduled meeting with his criminal associates. The timing was perfect. Federal agents captured him with boxes of documents that he'd been preparing to shred, providing additional evidence of obstruction of justice. Linda called me from the secure federal facility where she'd spent the night, her voice shaking with relief and residual fear. "Mom, they got him. Richard is in custody, and Agent Martinez says they arrested over 20 people connected to the criminal network. It's finally over." But for me, the victory was bittersweet. The business that Walter and I had built from nothing, the company that had provided livelihoods for dozens of employees and reliable service for thousands of customers, had been corrupted by Richard's criminal activities. Even with his arrest, Harrison Marine faced months of federal oversight and investigation that would damage our reputation and customer relationships. The immediate aftermath required careful management of both legal and business concerns. Dr. Sullivan worked with federal prosecutors to negotiate the terms of Harrison Marine's cooperation with ongoing investigations. The company would pay significant fines for the regulatory violations that had occurred under Richard's management, but would avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for full cooperation with law enforcement. Frank Morrison agreed to serve as interim manager of Harrison Marine, while federal investigators completed their review of company operations. His decades of maritime industry experience and unblemished reputation provided the credibility necessary to maintain customer relationships during the transition period. Most importantly, Linda began the process of divorce proceedings that would legally separate her from Richard's criminal activities and financial obligations. Dr. Sullivan's expertise in maritime law proved invaluable in protecting Linda's interests, while ensuring her continued cooperation with federal investigators. The confrontation I'd been planning for months finally occurred in the federal courthouse, where Richard was brought for his initial hearing. Dressed in the business attire that Frank's wife had provided, I sat in the gallery as federal prosecutors read the charges against the man who'd tried to destroy everything Walter and I had built. When Richard's eyes met mine across the courtroom, his expression shifted from confident denial to shocked recognition. For the first time, he truly saw Dorothy Harrison as she actually was, not a confused elderly woman whose concerns could be dismissed, but a formidable adversary who had orchestrated his downfall while he believed she was helplessly confined to a nursing home. The psychological impact was devastating to his composure. Richard's attorney had clearly prepared him to maintain his innocence and challenge the federal evidence as circumstantial or fabricated. But seeing me in the courtroom, obviously lucid and strategically positioned, shattered his confidence in the narrative he'd constructed about my mental decline and institutional helplessness. Agent Martinez later told me that Richard's reaction in the courtroom had been a turning point in their interrogation strategy. When he saw you there, looking like the businesswoman you've always been rather than the confused victim he'd described, to his associates, he realized that everything he'd told them about eliminating threats was based on false assumptions. That's when he started considering cooperation rather than continued denial. The plea negotiations that followed revealed the full scope of Richard's criminal activities and the extensive network of legitimate businesses that had been corrupted to support organized crime operations. Harrison Marine had been just one component of a sophisticated operation that had generated millions in illegal profits while maintaining the appearance of successful legitimate enterprises. Richard's cooperation with federal investigators ultimately led to the dismantling of criminal operations across the Pacific Northwest. The stolen goods networks, money laundering schemes, and smuggling operations that had used maritime businesses as cover were systematically identified and shut down by coordinated law enforcement action. But the personal victory was more complex than simple justice. Linda would spend months in therapy dealing with the psychological impact of discovering that her marriage had been built on criminal deception. The employees of Harrison Marine faced uncertainty about their jobs and their association with a company that had been used for illegal activities. The customers who had trusted our reputation for honest dealing questioned whether they could continue those relationships. The nursing home that had been my prison for months suddenly felt like a strategic headquarters where I'd coordinated one of the most successful investigations in maritime crime history. The staff who had witnessed my transformation from apparently confused resident to sharp-eyed business strategist treated me with a respect that bordered on awe. But the most satisfying moment came when I finally returned to the waterfront home that Walter and I had designed together, walking through rooms that Richard had claimed as his own while planning my permanent silence. The view of the marina, through our floor-to-ceiling windows, showed Harrison Marine's facilities being restored to legitimate operations under Frank Morrison's capable management. Richard Patterson had believed that stealing a 70-year-old widow's business and confining her to institutional care would eliminate any threat to his criminal empire. He'd underestimated the strategic thinking that had built Harrison Marine from a single dock space into a regional maritime power. Most fatally, he'd underestimated what happens when you threaten the family and legacy of a woman who'd spent 4 decades proving that preparation. Persistence and superior planning always triumph over arrogance and criminal ambition. The game was over, and Dorothy Harrison had won decisively. The federal courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning of Richard Patterson's sentencing. Representatives from maritime businesses across the Pacific Northwest filled the gallery. their presence a testament to the industry-wide impact of the criminal network that had been dismantled through months of careful investigation. I sat in the front row, wearing the navy blue suit that had become my armor during this long battle for justice and vindication. 6 months had passed since Richard's arrest, and the transformation in my life had been extraordinary. The competency hearing that had legally restored my rights and freedoms had been a mere formality. Dr. Williams's testimony about my strategic coordination of the federal investigation had demolished any lingering questions about my mental acuity. The nursing home that had been my prison was now simply a chapter in the story of how Dorothy Harrison had orchestrated the downfall of a criminal empire while her enemies believed she was powerless. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to my ally Frank, called the courtroom to order with the gravity befitting the conclusion of one of the largest maritime crime prosecutions in Oregon's history. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chang rose to address the court, carrying with him the weight of evidence that had taken federal investigators 2 years to compile and verify. Your Honor, Chang began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, the defendant Richard Patterson orchestrated a criminal enterprise that defrauded legitimate businesses of over $3 million, laundered money for organized crime operations spanning 4 states, and used threats of violence to silence witnesses who might expose his activities. The scope and sophistication of these crimes demanded the full resources of federal law enforcement to investigate and prosecute. Richard sat at the defense table, his once immaculate appearance now showing the strain of months in federal custody. The man who had manipulated his way into my family's trust and systematically stolen from the business Walter and I had built looked diminished, his confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed resignation of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. Completely. The prosecutor's presentation methodically detailed each aspect of Richard's criminal activities. The fake invoices that had drained hundreds of thousands from Harrison Marine's accounts. The shell companies used to launder money from drug trafficking and illegal gambling operations. The warehouse facilities that had stored stolen merchandise for distribution throughout the Pacific Northwest. The coordination with criminal associates who had used legitimate maritime businesses as cover for smuggling operations. But Chang's most damning evidence concerned Richard's plans for permanently silencing witnesses to his crimes. The text messages discovered on his phone had provided federal investigators with proof of conspiracy to commit murder, elevating the charges from financial crimes to violent felonies that carried mandatory minimum sentences. The defendant's communications with his criminal associates clearly indicate plans to eliminate Dorothy Harrison because her knowledge of legitimate Harrison Marine operations posed a threat to their illegal activities, Chang explained to the eyed court. Mrs. Harrison's strategic thinking and industry relationships had enabled her to identify discrepancies that could expose the entire criminal network. Rather than face accountability for his theft and fraud, the defendant chose to plan her murder. Linda sat beside me, her presence a source of strength and pride as the prosecution detailed how her courage in discovering and reporting Richard's threatening messages had prevented a tragedy while providing crucial evidence for the federal case. The therapy sessions that had helped her process the psychological trauma of discovering her husband's criminal activities had also revealed her own strength and resilience. The victim impact statements provided the most powerful testimony of the day. Captain Sarah Chen described how the fake safety equipment purchases had endangered fishing crews who believed they'd acquired emergency gear through Harrison Marine's reputation for reliable service. Miguel Rodriguez detailed how his trucking company had been used to create false delivery records that facilitated Richard's fraud, while potentially exposing his drivers to criminal liability. Harbor Master Janet Williams explained how Richard's misuse of maritime permits and licenses had undermined regulatory systems designed to ensure port security and legitimate commerce. The corruption of established businesses like Harrison Marine, for criminal purposes, threatened the integrity of the entire maritime industry along the Oregon coast. But my own victim impact statement carried the weight of personal betrayal combined with professional violation. Rising from my seat, I faced the man who had tried to steal not just my company's assets, but my dignity, my freedom, and ultimately, my life. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. Richard Patterson didn't just steal money from Harrison Marine. He stole the trust that my late husband Walter and I had spent 40 years building with our customers, suppliers, and employees. He corrupted the reputation for honest dealing that was the foundation of everything we had accomplished in the maritime industry. I paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle before continuing. But his greatest crime was the systematic manipulation and emotional abuse of my daughter Linda, who trusted him completely while he planned to make her a widow and an accessory to criminal activities she knew nothing about. The psychological damage from discovering that her marriage was built on criminal deception will take years to heal. Turning slightly to face Richard directly, I delivered the words I'd been rehearsing since the day he'd had me committed to Sunset Manor. You believed that putting me in a nursing home would silence me permanently, that a 70-year-old widow posed no threat to your criminal empire. You underestimated what 4 decades in the maritime industry teaches about preparation, persistence, and strategic thinking. Most fatally, you underestimated what happens when you threaten a family that has built something meaningful through honest work and mutual respect. The defense attorney's plea for leniency fell on deaf ears. Richard's cooperation with federal investigators had helped dismantle the larger criminal network, but his role as architect of the scheme and his plans for violence against witnesses weighed heavily against any consideration of reduced sentences. Judge Morrison's sentencing remarks reflected the seriousness of crimes that had violated both financial regulations and the fundamental trust required for legitimate commerce. The defendant's actions went far beyond typical white-collar crime, she observed. The use of legitimate businesses to facilitate organized crime operations, combined with conspiracy to commit murder to silence witnesses, represents a level of criminal sophistication that demands substantial punishment. Richard Patterson was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. The financial restitution ordered by the court exceeded $4 million, ensuring that victims of his crimes would recover their losses while eliminating any possibility that he could profit from his criminal activities. But the legal victory was only the beginning of rebuilding what Richard had tried to destroy. Harrison Marine faced months of federal oversight as investigators verified that all criminal activities had been eliminated and legitimate operations restored. Frank Morrison's management during this transition period had been exemplary, maintaining customer relationships while implementing new financial controls that would prevent future fraud. The business recovery required rebuilding trust that had been damaged by association with criminal activities. Many customers had remained loyal throughout the investigation, recognizing that Harrison Marine had been victimized rather than complicit in Richard's crimes. But others required careful reassurance that their dealings would be with the honest maritime business that Walter and I had originally built. The employee situation presented complex challenges. Several longtime Harrison Marine workers had unknowingly facilitated Richard's criminal activities by processing fake invoices or handling suspicious shipments. While they faced no criminal liability due to their lack of knowledge about the illegal nature of these transactions, they struggled with feelings of betrayal and uncertainty about their professional futures. I addressed these concerns through a series of company meetings that Frank Morrison arranged after my legal competency was restored, and I could resume active involvement in business operations. Standing before employees who had known me for decades, I acknowledged the trauma that everyone had experienced while emphasizing our shared commitment to restoring Harrison Marine's reputation for integrity. We were all victims of Richard Patterson's criminal manipulation, I told the assembled workers. He used our legitimate business operations and honest work to provide cover for illegal activities that violated everything Harrison Marine has always represented. But his crimes don't diminish the value of the work you've done or the service you've provided to our customers over the years. The rebuilding process also required addressing the personal relationships that had been damaged by Richard's systematic manipulation. Linda's healing journey included recognizing how her husband had isolated her from friends and family members who might have questioned his activities or provided alternative perspectives on his behavior. My relationship with Linda required careful reconstruction as well. The months when she'd dismissed my concerns about Richard's activities had created distance between us that couldn't be bridged simply by vindication of my accusations. We needed to rebuild trust and communication that had been damaged by Richard's calculated interference in our family dynamics. The therapy sessions that Linda and I attended together provided opportunities to process not just the trauma of discovering Richard's crimes, but the deeper issues of how his manipulation had affected our mother-daughter relationship. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the family counselor who worked with victims of criminal domestic manipulation, helped us understand how Richard's behavior had followed classic patterns of isolation and control. Sophisticated manipulators like Richard target family relationships specifically because they understand that creating distance between victims and their support systems makes control easier, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. Linda's dismissal of your concerns wasn't a failure of judgment. It was the intended result of psychological manipulation designed to isolate both of you from each other. The financial recovery took longer than the emotional healing. Harrison Marine's assets that had been frozen during the federal investigation were gradually released as prosecutors confirmed that they represented legitimate business value rather than proceeds from criminal activities. But the company's credit relationships and supplier agreements required extensive renegotiation due to the regulatory violations that had occurred under Richard's management. The insurance claims for the stolen equipment and fraudulent transactions provided partial compensation for the financial losses, but the administrative costs of documenting the fraud and coordinating with federal investigators consumed significant resources. Frank Morrison's expertise in maritime business operations proved invaluable during this period, as he understood both the industry relationships and regulatory requirements necessary for full recovery. My return to active involvement in Harrison Marine was gradual but determined. The strategic thinking skills that had built the company from a single dock space into a regional maritime power were undimmed by age or the trauma of Richard's criminal activities. If anything, the experience of coordinating a complex investigation while confined to a nursing home had demonstrated that Dorothy Harrison remained a formidable businesswoman capable of handling whatever challenges the maritime industry might present. The physical return to my waterfront home was deeply meaningful after months of institutional confinement. Walking through rooms that Richard had claimed as his own while planning my permanent silence, I felt Walter's presence in every carefully crafted detail of the house we'd designed together. The view of Harrison Marine's marina facilities through our floor-to-ceiling windows showed legitimate operations being restored under honest management. The home also required restoration from the damage that Richard's occupancy had caused. Not physical damage, but the psychological contamination that comes from knowing a criminal had planned violence while sitting at our kitchen table and sleeping in our bedroom. Linda and I worked together to reclaim the space, replacing furnishings that held unpleasant associations while preserving the elements that connected us to Walter's memory and our family's legitimate legacy. The industry recognition that followed. The successful prosecution was both gratifying and humbling. The Pacific Northwest Maritime Association presented me with their Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing not just 4 decades of successful business operations, but also the courage to expose criminal activities that had threatened the integrity of the entire industry. Captain Sarah Chen's introduction at the awards ceremony captured the sentiment of colleagues who had watched the investigation unfold. Dorothy Harrison didn't just expose one man's crimes, she said to the assembled maritime professionals. She demonstrated that the values of honesty, preparation, and mutual respect that built our industry are stronger than the greed and deception that criminals try to use against us. But the most meaningful recognition came from the employees of Harrison Marine, who presented me with a plaque commemorating my strategic leadership during extraordinary circumstances. The inscription read, "To Dorothy Harrison, who proved that wisdom and determination can triumph over any adversity. The federal investigators who had worked on the case remained in contact long after Richard's sentencing, occasionally consulting me about other maritime crime cases where my industry knowledge might prove helpful. Agent Martinez had become a friend as well as a professional contact, often remarking that the Harrison Marine investigation had set new standards for cooperation between private citizens and federal law enforcement. Your strategic approach to gathering evidence while maintaining operational security was textbook quality, she told me during one of our post-case conversations. Law enforcement agencies could learn from your methodology for conducting complex investigations while protecting witnesses and preserving evidence integrity. The nursing home where I'd spent those crucial months became an unexpected source of ongoing relationships. Several staff members had been so impressed by my transformation from apparently confused resident to sharp-eyed business strategist that they'd asked for advice about their own career challenges and family situations. Nurse Patricia eventually left Sunset Manor to pursue a business degree, crediting our conversations about strategic thinking and career planning for inspiring her educational goals. Linda's new life as a single woman required adjustments that went beyond simply divorcing a criminal husband. Richard's manipulation had affected her confidence in her own judgment, making decisions about career, relationships, and future plans feel overwhelming. But with therapy and family support, she gradually reclaimed the independence and self-assurance that had characterized her before Richard's influence. Her decision to complete the business degree that she'd abandoned when she married Richard represented both practical preparation for potentially managing Harrison Marine and symbolic reclamation of the goals that Richard had convinced her to sacrifice. Watching Linda study maritime business law and financial management filled me with pride that went beyond simple maternal satisfaction. It represented the restoration of the daughter I'd raised to be strong and independent. The question of Harrison Marine's future ownership and management became a family discussion that Walter would have appreciated for its combination of practical considerations and emotional significance. Linda's business education was providing her with the knowledge necessary to eventually assume leadership of the company. But her recent experiences had understandably made her cautious about taking on such responsibilities immediately. Frank Morrison's continued involvement as interim manager provided stability during Linda's preparation and my own recovery from the trauma of Richard's criminal activities. His maritime industry expertise and unblemished reputation had been crucial for maintaining customer relationships and regulatory compliance during the federal investigation and its aftermath. But the most important outcome of our family's ordeal was the deeper understanding of what truly matters in building something meaningful. The business success that Walter and I had achieved was important, but it was the foundation of honesty, mutual respect, and shared values that had enabled us to survive Richard's attempts at destruction. Standing on the deck of our waterfront home, 18 months after Richard's arrest, watching the sunset paint the marina in shades of gold and crimson, I reflected on the journey that had taken me from a garage to a nursing home to a federal courtroom and finally back to the life that Walter and I had built together. Richard Patterson had believed that age made me vulnerable, that grief made me weak, and that institutional confinement made me powerless. He'd underestimated the strategic thinking that had built Harrison Marine from nothing into a regional maritime power. Most fatally, he'd underestimated what happens when you threaten the family and legacy of a woman who'd spent 4 decades proving that preparation, persistence, and superior planning always triumph over criminal ambition. The seagulls that had once seemed like harbingers of confinement when I'd watched them from my nursing home window now appeared as symbols of freedom as they soared above the marina that bore our family name. Harrison Marine's flags flew proudly in the evening breeze, restored to their rightful place as symbols of honest commerce and reliable service. Dorothy Harrison was home, vindicated, and ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. The maritime industry had been warned that underestimating a 70-year-old businesswoman was always a fatal mistake, and I intended to make sure that lesson was never forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.